I never thought I'd be starting over at 69. The day Dr. Singh handed me that folded diagnosis letter, I was thinking about the apple pie cooling on my kitchen counter and whether Mira would actually show up for Sunday dinner this time, early stage. Ovarian cancer, he said gently, his kind eyes watching my face for reaction. 3 words that should have shattered my world. But sitting there in his sterile office, all I could think about was who I would call first, who would drop everything to be with me. The answer, I would soon discover, was no one. My 3 children, the ones I'd raised and sacrificed for, would treat my cancer like an inconvenience. But what would you do if your own family ignored the biggest crisis of your life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through my kitchen curtains the same way it had for the past 37 years in this house. I stood at the counter, running my fingers along the smooth granite surface Harold had insisted on installing during our last renovation. "It'll outlast us both," he joked then. He was right about the granite, wrong about us both being here. To see it, I picked up the family photo from last Christmas, the one Mira had staged so perfectly for her Instagram feed. There we all were, me in the center wearing the red sweater Casey had sent from some boutique in Colorado, Mira to my right in her designer everything, Devon and his wife, Sarah flanking the left with their 2 children, and Casey herself, tanned and glowing from her latest van life adventure. We looked like the picture of a close, loving family. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I'd spent 43 years as a librarian in this town, helping people find what they were looking for. I'd organized story times for toddlers, research sessions for teenagers, and book clubs for seniors. I'd been the keeper of everyone else's curiosities and dreams. But somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten to tend to my own. My children grew up in the spaces between those library shelves. Mira would sit at the circulation desk doing homework while I processed returns. Devon spent summers reading in the children's section, escaping into fantasy worlds while I shelved books around him. Casey, my free spirit, would reorganize the picture books into rainbow patterns until I'd find them hours later and have to sort them back into proper order. They were good children. Bright, accomplished, each following their own path. Mira had climbed the corporate ladder in Manhattan, becoming a senior executive at a prestigious PR firm that represented fashion brands I couldn't pronounce. She lived in a glass apartment overlooking Central Park, wore shoes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and spoke in industry jargon that sounded like a foreign language to me. Devon had found his calling in the world of wellness and mindfulness. After a brief stint in marketing that left him burned out and anxious, he'd reinvented himself as a stay-at-home dad and podcast host. His show, Mindful Moments with Devon, had a modest but dedicated following of other 30-something parents. Seeking balance, he quoted meditation teachers and spoke earnestly about intention setting, often borrowing phrases I'd shared with him over family dinners without attribution. Casey had rejected conventional life entirely, selling her possessions. At 25 to live in a converted van and document her travels for her YouTube channel and Instagram account. Van life with Casey showcased national parks, quirky roadside attractions, and the kind of unfiltered authenticity that attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. She made a living through sponsorships and affiliate marketing, selling the dream of freedom to people trapped in cubicles. I was proud of them all. But pride, I was learning, was different from proximity. Harold's absence still echoed through every room of this house. He'd been gone 3 years now, taken by a heart attack. That gave no warning, no time for goodbyes. The man who'd shared my bed for 41 years, who knew exactly how I liked my coffee and which side of the couch was mine, had simply collapsed while raking leaves in our backyard on a crisp October morning. In those first months after his death, the children had rallied. Mira took time off work to help with funeral arrangements. Devon drove up from Princeton every weekend to check on me. Casey actually stayed put for 2 whole weeks, parking her van in my driveway and helping me sort through Harold's belongings. But grief, I discovered, has an expiration date in other people's minds. After the initial shock wore off, after the Casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards were filed away. Everyone expected me to move on, to find a new normal, to stop being the widow and become just Tina again. The problem was, I wasn't sure who Tina was without Harold. I'd been half of a whole for so long that learning to be complete on my own felt like learning a new language at 66. I tried. I really had. I joined the community garden and grew tomatoes that I gave away because I couldn't eat them all myself. I volunteered at the animal shelter until the smell of disinfectant and sadness became too much. I even took a watercolor class at the community center, where I painted wobbly landscapes that looked like they'd been created by an enthusiastic 10-year-old dot, but nothing stuck. Nothing filled the Harold-shaped hole in my daily routine. The children called, of course. Mira every Tuesday evening, precisely at 7:30, slotted between her gym session and whatever networking event required her presence. Our conversations followed a predictable pattern. How was my week? Was I eating enough? Did I need anything from the store? Surface-level check-ins that felt more like items being crossed off a to-do list than genuine connection. Devon called sporadically, usually when he was driving to or from his kids' activities. I'd become background noise to his commute, away, to fill the empty space between soccer practice and piano lessons. He'd update me on his latest podcast episodes, his meditation retreats, his wife's book club, his children's achievements. When he asked about me, it felt perfunctory. Casey was the most unpredictable. She might facetime me from a mountain top in Utah or send a 3-paragraph text message at 2 in the morning about a sunset she'd witnessed. Her love felt genuine but scattered, like she was trying to maintain connection across vast distances, both physical and emotional. I understood. I really did. They had their own lives, their own families, their own struggles. Mira was fighting for a promotion in a cutthroat industry. Devon was managing 2 young children and a marriage while building his brand. Casey was chasing dreams and content across the country. But understanding didn't make the quiet any less loud. My neighbor Brenda was the only person who seemed to see me clearly these days. Brenda Rallins, 72 years old with silver hair that caught sunlight like spun metal and a laugh that could probably be heard from space. She'd moved into Doors Down about 5 years ago, after her own husband passed, and we developed the kind of friendship that blooms naturally between women who understand loss. Brenda had worked in television production for 30 years before retiring, and her house was filled with awards and photos from her time at various local stations. She'd produced everything from morning talk shows to community interest pieces, and she had stories that could keep you entertained for hours. More importantly, Brenda saw people. Really saw them, she noticed, when I'd been staying inside too long, when my garden was being neglected, when my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. She'd show up with coffee and gossip, or drag me to the farmer's market, or simply sit on my back porch and let me talk through whatever was weighing on my mind. Though, diagnosis letter sat on my kitchen table now, next to the family photo. Dr. Singh had been thorough in his explanation. Early-stage ovarian cancer, caught during a routine examination when I'd mentioned some persistent bloating and fatigue. The survival rates were good, especially with early detection. Surgery to remove the affected ovary, followed by a few rounds of chemotherapy as a precaution. 6 months of treatment, then regular monitoring. You're lucky, he'd said, we caught this early. With treatment, there's every reason to expect a full recovery. Lucky, I'd rolled that word around in my mind during the drive home. Lucky to have cancer, lucky to face surgery and chemotherapy at 69. Lucky to navigate this alone. But I wouldn't be alone. I told myself I had 3 children who loved me. They'd rally just like they had when Harold died. They'd take turns driving me to appointments, sitting with me during chemo sessions, helping me manage the side effects. We'd get through this together. That was yesterday's optimism. Today, staring at that perfect family photo, I was beginning to understand how naive I'd been. I'd called Mira first, reaching her during her lunch break. "Mum, that's awful," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used during difficult conversations, sympathy layered over impatience. "But you said it's early stage, right? So that's good news." You'll beat this, then, without waiting for my response. Listen, I'm actually heading into a meeting. Can we talk more about this tonight? Devon had answered on the second ring, probably, grateful for the distraction from whatever domestic chaos was unfolding in his household. I could hear his children arguing in the background as I explained the diagnosis. Oh wow, Mum, that's heavy, he'd said. But you know what? I really believe that cancer is often the body's way of telling us to slow down and listen to what we need. Maybe this is the universe's way of pushing you towards some personal growth. I'd sat in stunned silence as he launched into a monologue about the healing power of positive thinking. Casey had been the hardest to reach. Her phone went straight to voicemail, probably no signal wherever she was camped for the week. I'd left a message asking her to call, trying to strike the right balance between urgent and not wanting to panic her. 3 children, 3 different reactions, none of them quite what I'd hoped for. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, empty and weighted with this new knowledge. I made a cup of tea and sat in Harold's chair, my chair now, I supposed, and tried to imagine the next 6 months. Surgery, recovery, chemotherapy, side effects. Would I lose my hair? Would I be sick? Would I be able to take care of myself? For the first time since sitting in Dr. Singh's office, I felt truly afraid. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Casey's name flashed on the caller ID. Mum? I got your message. What's going on? I explained everything again, this time too. The sound of wind whipping across whatever remote location she was calling from. Casey listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. Oh, Mum, she said when I finished. That's so scary, but you're going to be okay, right? The doctor said it's treatable. Yes, he seems optimistic, but it's still going to be a difficult few months, of course. I wish I could be there with you right now. I'm actually in the middle of this amazing collaboration with a van life couple from Oregon, and we're creating this whole series about hidden gems in the Pacific Northwest. But maybe I could wrap things up early and drive back. I could hear the conflict in her voice, the genuine desire to help battling against the momentum of her carefully planned content schedule. You don't need to change your plans, I heard myself saying. I'll be fine. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. The silence that followed my phone calls was deafening. Not the peaceful quiet I'd grown accustomed to in my empty house, but something heavier, more pointed. It was the silence of expectations unmet, of calls not returned, of children too busy with their own lives to sit with their mother's fear. My landline sat on the kitchen counter like an accusation. That old beige rotary phone Harold had refused to replace, insisting that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'd kept it after he died, partly for nostalgia and partly because there was something comforting about its solid weight, its reliable presence. Now it marked me with its stillness. 3 days had passed since my conversation with Casey. 3 days of checking my phone obsessively, jumping at every notification, hoping for a follow-up call, a text, anything that suggested my children were thinking about their mother facing cancer alone. Instead, I'd received a 4-worded meme from Devon about warrior women, a brief text from Mira asking if I'd found a good oncologist yet, and complete radio silence from Casey. No one had asked about my fears, my treatment plan, or whether I needed company. During the long hours when anxiety crept in like fog, I'd always been the one to reach out, I realized. The one to maintain connection, to remember birthdays and anniversaries, to call just to check in. When had I become the keeper of our family's emotional labor? And more importantly, what happened when the keeper needed keeping? Dr. Singh had scheduled my surgery for the following month, with chemotherapy to begin 6 weeks after that. The timeline felt both too fast and too slow. Too fast because I wasn't ready to face the physical reality of cancer treatment, too slow because the waiting was eating away at me from the inside. I tried to distract myself with my usual routines. I'd reorganized my spice cabinet, weeded the garden until my knees ached, and read 3 novels that I couldn't remember as soon as I closed their covers. But the diagnosis followed me everywhere, a constant companion whispering questions I couldn't answer. Who would drive me to surgery? Who would wait in the hospital while they removed part of my body? Who would help me understand the discharge instructions and manage my recovery at home? These weren't abstract concerns. They were practical, immediate needs that required practical, immediate solutions. But every time I reached for the phone to call one of my children, something stopped me. Pride, maybe? Or the growing realization that I might not like their answers. It was Brenda who finally broke through my isolation. I was sitting on my back porch, staring at the tomato plants I'd neglected to water, when she appeared at my gate carrying a thermos and wearing a sundress that looked like it had been lifted from a 1960s magazine spread. "You look like hell," she announced, settling into the chair beside me without invitation. "And your garden looks worse," I laughed despite myself. "Good morning to you too, Brenda. It's 3 in the afternoon. Honey, when's the last time you looked at a clock?" She poured coffee from her thermos into a second cup she'd brought with her. "Now, are you going to tell me what's wrong, or do I have to guess?" There was something about Brenda's direct approach that bypassed all my careful defenses. Maybe it was the way she'd shown up without waiting for an invitation, or the fact that she'd noticed my distress when my own children hadn't. Whatever it was, the words came spilling out. I told her about the diagnosis, about the surgery and chemotherapy ahead, about my children's distant, distracted responses. I told her about the silence, about feeling invisible in my own family, about the growing fear that I might be facing the biggest challenge of my life entirely alone. Brenda listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she sat quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and watching my neglected tomatoes. "You know what your problem is," she finally said. "Cancer? No, smartass. Your problem is that you raised your children too well." I stared at her. "How is that a problem? You made their lives so comfortable, so supported, that they never learned to recognize real need. They've never seen you struggle because you never let them. You are always the solution, never the problem. So when you actually need something, they don't know how to see it." Her words hit like a physical blow. "Are you saying this is my fault?" "I'm saying it's complicated." Brenda turned in her chair to face me fully. "You spent 40 years being the person everyone could count on. You were the mom who showed up to every school event, the wife who managed every crisis, the neighbor who brought casseroles when people were hurting. You've been so good at taking care of everyone else that they forgot you might need taking care of too." I wanted to argue, to defend my children, to insist that they were good people who just happened to be busy. But sitting there in the afternoon heat, surrounded by the evidence of my own neglect, I couldn't find the words. What am I supposed to do? I asked instead. "You have two choices," Brenda said. "You can keep waiting for them to figure it out, or you can figure it out yourself." Figure what out? How to live a life that's about you for a change. That evening, I called Mira again. This time, I didn't wait for her to ask about my week or deflect to her own concerns. I cut straight to the point. "I need help," I said when she answered. There was a pause. "With what?" "With everything. Surgery, recovery, chemotherapy. I can't do this alone." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her mental calendar flipping, calculating costs and obligations. "Of course, Mum, of course we'll help. It's just ... Her voice trailed off. "Just what?" "It's a really complicated time right now. We're launching this huge campaign next month, and I'm literally the only person who can manage it. But maybe I could come up for a weekend, or we could hire someone to help." Hire someone? My own daughter wanted to hire someone to sit with me during cancer treatment. "Never mind," I said. "I'll figure it out." "Mom, don't be like that. I want to help. I just need to." I hung up. The phone rang immediately. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, voicemail again. After the third call, I unplugged it from the wall. The silence that followed was different from before. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of decision. For the first time in 3 days, I felt something other than anxiety. I felt angry. 43 years I'd worked at that library, helping other people find what they needed. 41 years of marriage, putting Harold's needs first because that's what good wives did. 29 years since Mira was born, 27 since Devon, 24 since Casey. Nearly 3 decades of organizing my life around their schedules, their crises, their triumphs. When Mira had needed help with her college applications, I'd spent weeks researching schools and editing essays. When Devon had his anxiety attacks in graduate school, I'd driven for hours each way every weekend for 2 months to help him through it. When Casey had decided to drop out of college to find herself, I'd supported her decision even when Harold thought she was throwing her life away. I'd been there for every milestone, every crisis, every moment when they'd needed a soft place to land, and now, when I needed them, they were too busy, distressed, too invested in their own lives to show up. The anger felt good. It felt clean and purposeful in a way that sadness didn't. Anger was energy, sadness was depletion. I plugged the phone back in and dialed Devon's number. "Mom, I've been trying to call you back. Mira said you hung up on her." "I need to know," I said without preamble, "whether you're planning to help me through my cancer treatment or not." "Not. Maybe. Not. We'll see. Not. It's complicated." "Yes or no?" "Well, of course I want to help, but that's not what I asked." "Mom, you're being really intense right now. Maybe you should talk to someone about managing the emotional side of your diagnosis. I actually know this great therapist who specializes in." I hung up on him too. Casey's number went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I sat in my kitchen as the sun set, surrounded by the detritus of my life with Harold, his reading glasses still on the counter, his coffee mug still in the dish drainer, his presence still woven into every corner of this house he'd never walk through again. For 3 years, I'd been living like a guest in my own life, waiting for someone to tell me what came next. My children had their own families, their own dreams, their own versions of happiness that didn't seem to include space for an aging mother with cancer. Fine. I picked up Dr. Singh's business card from where I'd left it beside the diagnosis letter. Beneath his office number was a smaller line of text: "Patient advocacy services available." I'd figure it out myself. But first, I needed to understand why it had taken a cancer diagnosis to make me realize how invisible I'd become in my own family. And more importantly, I needed to decide whether I was going to stay invisible or demand to be seen. The diagnosis letter stared back at me from the kitchen table, no longer a harbinger of doom, but a strange kind of liberation. Cancer had given me permission to put myself first, to ask for what I needed, to stop managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own. I thought about Brenda's words, how to live a life that's about you for a change. Maybe it was time to find out what that looked like. The morning after my confrontation with my children, I stood in my closet holding the volunteer badge I'd worn every Tuesday for the past 15 years. Tina Weisvard, volunteer coordinator, was printed beneath the library's logo in neat blue letters. Such a small thing to represent so much of my identity. I'd started volunteering at the Millbrook Public Library 6 months after Harold's death, partly to fill the empty hours and partly because libraries had always been my sanctuary. Even after retiring from my position as head librarian in the neighbouring town, I'd found it hard to stay away from the familiar rhythm of books being checked out and returned, patrons seeking answers to questions both mundane and profound. My role was simple on paper: coordinate the other volunteers, manage the book sale donations, organise community events. In reality, I'd become the unofficial therapist, mediator, and problem solver for anyone who walked through those doors. Mrs. Henderson needed help finding large print romance novels to escape her loneliness. Teenage Marcus needed a quiet place to do homework away from his chaotic home life. New mother Jennifer needed someone to hold her baby while she desperately searched for parenting books that might help her feel less lost. I gave freely to all of them. My time, my energy, my emotional labor. I listened to their problems, celebrated their successes, and remembered details about their lives that their own families sometimes forgot. When Mrs. Henderson's cat died, I brought her soup. When Marcus got accepted to college, I helped him navigate the financial aid forms. When Jennifer's baby took his first steps, I was the first person she called. But now, staring at that badge, I realized something I'd never acknowledged before: the giving only flowed in one direction. None of these people had ever asked about my life outside the library. When Harold died, they offered condolences but never followed up. When I mentioned my children, they'd smile politely but never inquired further. I'd become so good at being the helper that I'd made myself invisible as a person who might need help. It was a pattern I was beginning to recognize everywhere in my life. The library opened at 9, and I arrived at 8:30 as always to prepare for the day. The other volunteers, 3 retirees like myself, were already there, chatting over coffee in the break room. They looked up when I entered, their faces brightening with genuine warmth. "Tina." "Perfect timing," said Margaret, a former teacher, who'd been volunteering for nearly as long as I had. "We were just discussing the summer reading program. Do you think we should do individual prizes this year or focus on group goals?" For 15 years, they'd asked my opinion on everything. For 15 years, I'd had answers ready. Today, I stood there holding my volunteer badge and felt utterly empty. "I don't know," I said. The 3 women stared at me. In all our time working together, I'd never responded to a question with uncertainty. I was the one with ideas, solutions, backup plans for the backup plans. "Are you feeling all right?" asked Dorothy, her brow creased with concern. "You look a little pale." Here was my opening. 3 women who'd worked alongside me for years, asking about my well-being. I could tell them about the diagnosis, about the surgery and chemotherapy ahead, about my children's shocking indifference. I could finally be the one needing support instead of giving it. "I'm fine," I heard myself say. "Just tired." The moment passed, they accepted my answer and moved on to discussing display themes and vendor catalogues. I sat at the volunteer coordinator's desk and tried to focus on the schedule spreadsheet open on my computer, but the words blurred together. Why had I lied? Why couldn't I bring myself to tell these women, good women who genuinely cared about me, what was happening in my life? Because, I realized, I'd trained everyone in my life to see me as a source of stability, not a person with problems. I'd been so consistent in my role as the helper that any deviation felt like a betrayal of who I was supposed to be. The morning dragged by with painful normalcy. I processed book donations, scheduled volunteers for upcoming events, and helped patrons find what they were looking for. Every interaction felt like I was performing a version of myself that no longer fit quite right. During my lunch break, I sat in my car and called Dr. Singh's office. The receptionist who answered had a warm, efficient voice that made me feel immediately, "I'm calling about patient advocacy services," I said. "Of course. Are you currently one of Dr. Singh's patients?" I explained my situation, the diagnosis, the upcoming surgery, the lack of family support. The receptionist listened, without judgment, occasionally making sympathetic sounds that felt more genuine than anything I'd heard from my own children. "We have several options available," she said. "We can arrange for someone to accompany you to appointments, help with transportation, provide post-surgery support. There's also a support group that meets every Thursday evening. Many patients find it helpful to connect with others going through similar experiences. A support group. Strangers who would understand what I was facing better than my own family. I'd like information about all of it," I said. "Wonderful. I'll send you a packet with details. And Tina, you're not alone in this. We see patients navigate cancer treatment without family support more often than you might think. It doesn't make it less difficult, but you're definitely not alone." After hanging up, I sat in my car for several more minutes, processing what the receptionist had said. Other people face cancer alone. Other families failed to show up when it mattered most. My situation wasn't unique, which somehow made it both more heartbreaking and more manageable. When I returned to the library, I found Margaret reorganizing the children's section with the focused intensity of someone avoiding a difficult conversation. "Everything okay?" I asked. She looked up, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but I overheard part of your phone call earlier. I was coming back from the bathroom and heard you mention Dr. Singh. I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right health-wise?" So much for privacy. But maybe this was the universe giving me another chance to be honest, to let someone in my life see me as a person who needed support. "I was recently diagnosed with ovarian cancer," I said. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh, Tina, I'm so sorry. How are you handling it? What can we do to help?" There it was. The question my own children hadn't asked, what can we do to help? I'm still figuring that out, I admitted. Surgery next month, then chemotherapy. It's all happening pretty fast. Of course we'll cover your volunteer duties while you're in treatment, Margaret said immediately. Don't even think about that. And if you need rides to appointments or help with groceries or anything else, just ask. We're here for you. I felt tears threatening for the first time since the diagnosis. Not tears of fear or sadness, but tears of relief. Someone was offering practical help without being asked. Someone was seeing my need and responding to it. Thank you, I managed. That means more than you know. For the rest of the afternoon, word spread quietly among the library staff and regular volunteers. By closing time, I'd received 3 more offers of help, 2 hugs, and a casserole recipe. That someone's sister swore had gotten her through chemotherapy with minimal nausea. These people, colleagues, really not close friends, were responding to my diagnosis with more practical support than my own children had offered. Driving home, I found myself thinking about the patterns I'd established in all my relationships. At the library, at church, in my neighborhood, even with my children, I'd positioned myself as the one who gave, who solved, who managed. I'd been so effective in that role that people had stopped seeing me as someone who might have needs of her own, but there was something else troubling me, something I was reluctant to acknowledge even to myself. Maybe I'd chosen that role because it felt safer than being vulnerable. Maybe I'd trained people to see me as the helper because being the one who needed help felt too scary, too exposing. Maybe my children's inability to show up for me was partly my own fault because I'd never taught them how. When I pulled into my driveway, Brenda was sitting on my front steps like she'd been waiting for me. "How was your day?" she asked, standing and brushing off her jeans. "Illuminating," I said. "And complicated. The best days usually are. Want to talk about it over dinner? I've got a part roast in the slow cooker that's big enough to feed a small army." I looked at this woman who'd shown up in my life like an unexpected gift. Brenda, who asked direct questions and offered practical help and didn't seem to need me to be anything other than exactly who I was. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." As we walked toward her house, I realized I was still carrying my volunteer badge. Such a small thing, but it had become a symbol of everything I was questioning about my life. All the ways I'd made myself essential to others while somehow becoming invisible as a person with my own needs and desires. Tomorrow, I decided I would start figuring out who Tina was when she wasn't busy being indispensable to everyone else. Brenda's house was like stepping into a time capsule of television history. The walls were covered with framed photos from her 3 decades in local broadcasting. Brenda interviewing the mayor during the 1995 flooding. Brenda at various award ceremonies. Brenda behind the scenes at morning shows I remembered watching while getting my children ready for school. "You really did all this," I said, pausing in front of a photo that showed her directing a camera crew during what looked like a live broadcast. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" Brenda handed me a glass of wine and gestured toward her collection. "Sometimes I look at these pictures and wonder if they're from someone else's life." Retirement has a way of making your past feel like fiction. We settled into her living room, where more evidence of her television career was artfully displayed. A shelf held various awards: Outstanding Community Programming, Excellence in Local Journalism, Viewers' Choice Award, mixed in with books and plants, and the normal detritus of daily life. "Tell me about it," I said, gesturing toward the awards. "I mean, really tell me, not the modest version you usually give." Brenda's eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before. "You want the real story." For the next hour, over part roast that was indeed excellent, Brenda told me about her career in ways she'd never shared before. How she'd started as a production assistant in 1985, making coffee and organising scripts for minimum wage. How she'd worked her way up through sheer determination and a willingness to say yes to every opportunity. How she'd eventually become the producer of Morning Connections, a human interest show that featured local stories and community spotlights. "The best part," she said, cutting another piece of meat, "was finding people with interesting stories and helping them tell those stories to the world." You'd be amazed how many fascinating people are living quiet lives right under our noses. Like what? Oh, everything. The postal worker who'd been writing and illustrating children's books for 30 years but never published them. The grandmother who started a support group for people caring for family members with dementia and ended up changing county policy. The retired teacher who was building furniture for families who couldn't afford it. She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. Actually, that last one reminds me of you. I don't build furniture. No, but you've been quietly helping people for decades without recognition. Do you have any idea how many lives you've touched through your work at the library? I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. I just did my job. Bullshit, Brenda said. Down her fork and fixed me with a look that was both gentle and fierce. You went way beyond your job, and you know it. Mrs. Henderson told me you drove her to the emergency room last winter when she was having chest pains. Marcus Williams credits you with helping him get into college. That young mother, what's her name? Jennifer. She told me you basically saved her sanity during her postpartum depression. Anyone would have done the same. No, they wouldn't have. And that's exactly my point. Brenda leaned forward. You've been living this incredible story of service and compassion for decades. But you've never told it as a story. You've never positioned yourself as anything other than just someone doing what anyone would do. What are you getting at? Brenda stood and walked over to a box sitting on her bookshelf. She pulled out a collection of business cards held together with a rubber band. These are from every contact I made during my 30 years in television. Producers, hosts, directors, camera, operators, journalists. I kept them because you never know when you might need to call in a favor. She sat back down and started flipping through the cards. There's something I've been thinking about since our conversation yesterday, about you figuring out how to live. A life that's about you for a change. Okay, ... What if your cancer diagnosis isn't just a medical crisis? What if it's also an opportunity? I stared at her. An opportunity for what? To tell your story. To finally be seen for who you really are instead of just what you do for other people. She pulled a specific card from the stack and held it up. Janet Ortiz. She hosts mornings in Morris County on Channel 12. I produced that show for 8 years before I retired. Janet's always looking for real stories about real people overcoming challenges. Brenda, I'm not looking to be on television. Why not? The question caught me off guard. Why not? Because I wasn't the type of person who went on television. Because I didn't have anything interesting to say. Because the idea of strangers knowing my business felt terrifying and presumptuous. Because I'm nobody special, I said finally. Says who? Says reality. I'm a retired librarian from suburban New Jersey whose own children can't be bothered to care about her cancer diagnosis. What's television worthy about that? Brenda set down the business card and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Can I tell you something that might hurt your feelings? At this point, why not? You've spent so long being invisible that you've convinced yourself invisibility is the same thing as being ordinary. But the two aren't the same at all. She got up and pulled another photo from the wall, this one showing her interviewing an elderly man in what looked like a workshop filled with wooden toys. This is Henry Calabresi, 92 years old when I interviewed him. Spent 40 years as a janitor at the elementary school, completely unremarkable as far as anyone knew. Then I found out he'd been hand-carving wooden toys for every child in his apartment building for Christmas, had been doing it for 25 years. Never asked for recognition, never even signed his name to the toys. She handed me the photo. When we aired his story, we got 300 phone calls in the first hour. People were crying, wanting to nominate him for awards, wanting to help him expand his toy-making operation. Henry thought he was nobody special too. But sometimes being nobody special is exactly what makes you special. I studied the photo. Henry looked overwhelmed, but pleased, surrounded by examples of his beautiful handiwork. What happened to him? He got so many requests for toys that he started a small business with his grandson. Last I heard, they were supplying toys to 3 children's hospitals and a dozen daycare centers. All because someone finally saw his story as worth telling. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's different. He was creating something beautiful, helping children ... and you've been helping people find what they need for 40 years. You've been a source of stability and support for countless families. You've given more of yourself than most people give in 3 lifetimes. And now you're facing cancer with more grace and dignity than your own children can manage. Brenda retrieved the business card and held it out to me again. That's not ordinary, Tina, that's extraordinary. I took the card but didn't look at it. Even if that were true, what would I say? Hi, I'm Tina and my family sucks. No, you'd say hi. I'm Tina and I'm learning what it means to advocate for myself after a lifetime of advocating for everyone else. You'd say I'm discovering that sometimes the people who need our support most are the ones who've spent their lives supporting others. You'd say I'm proof that it's never too late to demand to be seen. I looked down at the business card. Janet Ortiz, host-producer, Mornings in Morris County. There was a photo, a woman about my daughter Mira's age with kind eyes and a warm smile. What if she's not interested? What if she is? What if I make a fool of myself? What if you don't? I thought about my conversation with the library volunteers that afternoon. How they'd responded to my news with immediate offers of practical help. How strangers had shown me more compassion in one afternoon than my own children had in 3 days. What if my children see it and get angry? Brenda's laugh was sharp and not entirely kind. What if they do? What are they going to do? Ignore you? Stop calling? Honey, they're already doing that. The truth of that statement hit me like a physical blow. My children were already treating me like an inconvenience. They'd already made it clear that my cancer diagnosis was something to be managed around their real priorities, not something that warranted reorganizing their lives. What exactly was I protecting by staying quiet? I need to think about it, I said. Of course you do. But while you're thinking, remember something, your story matters. Your experience matters, the way you've lived your life matters. And the fact that you're facing this challenge alone doesn't make you pathetic, it makes you strong as hell. That night, I sat in my bedroom holding Janet Ortiz's business card and thinking about Henry Calabrese. Had he felt scared when Brenda first approached him about sharing his story? Had he worried about seeming presumptuous or attention-seeking? I thought about all the stories I'd helped patrons research at the library over the years. Local history projects, genealogy research, people looking to understand their place in the larger narrative of their community. I'd help them find their stories, document their stories, preserve their stories for future generations. But I'd never considered that I might have a story worth telling too. The diagnosis letter was still on my nightstand, folded now, but still present. Tomorrow would mark a week since Dr. Singh had handed it to me, a week since my world had shifted on its axis. In that week, I'd learned things about my family and myself that I'd spent years avoiding. Maybe it was time to stop avoiding and start acting. I picked up my phone and, before I could lose my nerve, typed out a text message to Mira, Devon, and Casey in our family group chat. I wanted to let you all know that I'll be having surgery next month to treat my cancer. I've arranged for support through the hospital and local volunteers. I'm not asking you to change your plans, but I thought you should know. I stared at the message for several minutes before hitting send. The responses came quickly. Mira, Mom, you don't need to be so formal with us. Of course. We want to help however we can. Devon, this feels like you're trying to make us feel guilty. That's not healthy communication. Casey, wait, what? Surgery? When did this get so serious? I turned off my phone without responding, let them process their own discomfort with my new directness. I was done managing their emotions for them. Janet Ortiz's business card sat on my nightstand next to the diagnosis letter. Two pieces of paper that represented 2 very different paths forward, one familiar, safe, invisible, the other unknown, terrifying, and potentially transformative. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to choose the unknown. The TV studio guest pass felt impossibly official in my hand. Guest, Tina Weisfard, was printed in bold letters beneath the Channel 12 logo, along with today's date and Mornings in Morris County tape date. Such a small thing to represent such a monumental shift in my understanding of myself that it had taken 2 weeks for Brenda to arrange the interview. 2 weeks during which my children's responses to my cancer diagnosis had become increasingly theatrical and self-serving. Mira had called 3 times to explain why she couldn't take time off work, each conversation growing more elaborate in its justifications. Devon had sent me a care package filled with crystals and essential oils, along with a handwritten note about healing energy that felt more like a spiritual bypass than genuine support. Casey had posted a cryptic Instagram story about toxic family dynamics without ever calling to ask about my surgery date. Meanwhile, I'd attended my first cancer support group meeting. The meeting was held in the basement of St. Mark's Lutheran Church, in a room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly grey. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, a card table with coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration, and 8 people I'd never seen before who understood what I was going through better than my own family. There was Margaret, not the Margaret from the library, but a different Margaret, 74, currently in remission from breast cancer and serving as the group's unofficial coordinator. Robert, 67, managing prostate cancer with his characteristically dry humour. Susan, 59, dealing with lymphoma while caring for her mother with dementia. And 5 others, each carrying their own version of the burden I was learning to navigate. The hardest part, Margaret had said during my first meeting, isn't the cancer itself. It's discovering who really shows up for you when you need them most. The nods around the circle had been immediate and knowing. These strangers understood something my children couldn't or wouldn't grasp. That cancer diagnosis strips away all the polite pretenses and reveals the true nature of every relationship in your life. I expected my sister to be there for me. Susan had shared, we'd been close our whole lives. But when I got sick, she just disappeared, said my cancer was too triggering for her because our mother died of breast cancer. Meanwhile, my mailman checks on me every day and brings my packages to the door so I don't have to walk down the driveway. The stories were variations on a theme I was beginning to recognize. Family members who vanished when real support was needed, friends who offered thoughts and prayers but no practical help, and strangers, casual acquaintances, even people in service positions who stepped up in ways that defied expectation. It was Robert who'd first suggested I had a story worth sharing publicly. You're not the first person to discover that their family can't handle their cancer diagnosis, he'd said after I'd shared my experience during my second meeting. But you might be the first retired librarian to articulate it so clearly. The way you talk about emotional labor and invisible caregiving, that's something people need to hear. I'm not trying to expose my family, I'd protested. You're not exposing them. You're exposing a system that teaches women to be endlessly giving, while never asking for anything in return. That's bigger than your family, that's societal. When I'd mentioned Brenda's suggestion about the television interview, the entire group had erupted in encouragement. Margaret had clapped her hands together like I'd announced I was running for president. Susan had pulled out her phone to find the Channel 12 website. Even Robert, who was generally skeptical of what he called emotional exhibitionism, had nodded approvingly. Good, he'd said. Maybe it'll help other people recognize the pattern before they're 69 and facing cancer alone. Now, standing in the Channel 12 parking lot holding my guest pass, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Brenda had driven me to the studio, chattering nervously about lighting and camera angles and how to sit, so I wouldn't look washed out. Under the studio lights, she was more anxious about this interview than I was, which was saying something because my hands hadn't stopped shaking since I'd woken up at 5 a.m. Remember, she said, as we walked toward the building, Janet is good people. She's not looking to exploit your story or make you look foolish. She genuinely cares about highlighting real people dealing with real challenges. What if I start crying? Then you start crying. It's television, not brain surgery. People cry on TV all the time. What if I freeze up and can't talk? Then Janet will ask you easier questions until you find your voice again. She's been doing this for 15 years, Tina. She knows how to work with people who aren't professional performers. The studio lobby was smaller than I'd expected. with walls covered in promotional photos from various local programs. There was Janet Ortiz interviewing the mayor, Janet with a group of high school students who'd won some kind of science competition, Janet sitting across from an elderly couple celebrating their 70th wedding anniversary, Tina Weisfard, a young woman with a clipboard and the kind of efficiency that comes from managing multiple moving parts approached us. I'm Sarah, the production assistant. Janet is finishing up a pre-interview with our cooking segment guest, but she'll be with you in just a few minutes. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? Tea? Water would be great, I said, my mouth suddenly dry as sand. Sarah led us to a small room labelled green room, though it was actually painted beige. There was a love seat, a coffee table with magazines, and a mirror surrounded by Hollywood-style bulbs. I sat down and immediately stood back up, too nervous to be still. This is normal, Brenda said, settling into the love seat with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in television studios. Everyone's nervous before their first interview. But once you start talking to Janet, you'll forget the cameras are even there. Somehow I doubted that. 20 minutes later, Janet Ortiz herself appeared in the doorway. She was smaller than she looked on television, with silver-streaked brown hair and laugh lines that suggested she smiled, more often than not. She wore a simple blue dress that probably looked more expensive than it was, and carried herself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. Tina, I'm so glad you agreed to do this, she said, crossing the room to shake my hand. Brenda has told me wonderful things about you, and your story really resonates with me. I think our viewers are going to connect with your experience in a meaningful way. I'm not sure I have anything particularly meaningful to say, I said. Let me be the judge of that, Janet said with a warm smile. Can I tell you what drew me to your story? I nodded. Every week, I interview people who are dealing with challenges, overcoming obstacles, making a difference in their community. And almost every week, I meet someone who's been quietly giving their all to other people while neglecting their own needs. Your story, a woman who spent decades caring for everyone else only to discover that care doesn't automatically flow both ways, that's something a lot of our viewers will recognize in their own lives. She sat down across from me, her posture relaxed and inviting. This isn't about exposing your family or making anyone look bad. This is about starting a conversation about the invisible emotional labor that many people, especially women, carry throughout their lives, and about what happens when the people who've been giving endlessly suddenly need to receive. What if my children see this and think I'm trying to embarrass them? Are you trying to embarrass them? No, I'm trying to understand how I raised 3 successful, intelligent adults who can't recognize when their mother needs support. Then that's what we'll talk about. Not from a place of blame, but from a place of genuine curiosity about family, dynamics and social expectations. Janet's approach made the interview feel less like an interrogation and more like a conversation with a thoughtful friend. We talked about my career as a librarian, my role as a mother and wife, the patterns of giving that had defined most of my adult life. We talked about Harold's death and the loneliness that had followed, about my volunteer work, and my relationships with library patrons who needed more support than books could provide. And then we talked about the diagnosis, when you received your cancer diagnosis, Janet said. Who was the first person you wanted to call? My daughter Mira, I said without hesitation. She's the oldest, and she's always been the one I'd turn to for practical matters. And how did that conversation go? I paused, thinking about how to articulate the disappointment without sounding like I was attacking my own child. She was sympathetic, but distant. She told me it was awful, then immediately said she had to go to a meeting. She asked if I'd found a good oncologist, but didn't ask how I was feeling or whether I needed anything. That must have been difficult. It was confusing more than anything. I kept thinking I must have explained it wrong, or maybe she didn't understand how serious it was. So I called my son, and then my youngest daughter, and the conversations were similar, sympathetic, but detached, like I was telling them about someone else's problems rather than asking for their support. What did you do then? I got angry, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. For the first time in probably 20 years, I got genuinely angry at my children. And then I started wondering whether I'd raised them to expect that I would always be the one giving support, never the one needing it. Can you elaborate on that? I thought about all the times I'd dropped everything to help them through crises, all the ways I'd positioned myself as endlessly available and capable. I think I taught them that I was the solution to problems, not someone who could have problems of her own. I was so good at being the person they could count on that they never learned to see me as someone who might need counting on. The conversation continued for what felt like both hours and minutes. Janet asked thoughtful questions that helped me articulate feelings I'd been struggling to understand. We talked about the difference between being needed and being valued, about the invisibility that can come from being too reliable, about the ways women are socialized to give without asking for reciprocal support. What would you want other people in similar situations to know? Janet asked as we wrapped up. That your worth isn't determined by what you can do for other people, I said. And that asking for help isn't selfish, it's human. I spent so many years making myself indispensable that I forgot I was also entitled to care and support. And what's next for you? Surgery in 2 weeks, then chemotherapy, but also ... I paused, thinking about the support group, about the relationships I was building with people who saw me as more than just a caregiver. Also figuring out who I am when I'm not busy being what everyone else needs me to be. When the cameras stopped rolling, Janet leaned forward and squeezed my hand. That was beautiful, Tina, truly. I think you've given voice to something a lot of people feel but can't articulate. When will it air? Tomorrow morning. Are you ready for people to respond? I looked at Brenda, who was beaming with pride and something that looked like vindication. I don't know. But I guess I'm about to find out. The guest pass in my hand suddenly felt like a diploma or a passport, evidence that I'd done something brave, something that marked a before and after in my understanding of myself. Tomorrow, strangers would hear my story and see me not as someone's mother or someone's volunteer coordinator, but as Tina, just Tina, with her own experiences and insights worth sharing. For better or worse, I was about to discover what it felt like to be seen. The makeup mirror in the Channel 12 green room had shown me a version of myself I barely recognized. Not because of the professional makeup artist's work, though she'd done wonders with concealer and powder, but because of the expression looking back at me. For the first time in years, I looked like someone who had something to say rather than someone waiting to be told what was needed. That was yesterday. Today, I sat in my kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, fully dressed and holding a cup of coffee I was too nervous to drink, waiting for mornings in Morris County to air my segment. The interview had been taped yesterday afternoon, but Janet had explained that morning show segments often aired the next day to fit with the program scheduling needs. Brenda had promised to come over to watch with me, but her presence wouldn't arrive for another hour. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., my mind cycling through everything I'd said during the interview, wondering if I'd been too honest, too critical of my children, too presumptuous in thinking my experience mattered to anyone beyond my immediate circle. My phone sat silent on the counter. No calls from my children, no texts asking about the interview they didn't know was happening. Their absence felt both painful and liberating. Painful because it confirmed my growing understanding of how peripheral I'd become in their lives. Liberating because it meant I could stop waiting for their approval before making decisions. About my own story, the cancer support group had become my Tuesday evening ritual in the 3 weeks since I'd started attending. Last Tuesday, after I told them about the upcoming television interview, Margaret had shared something that had been rattling around in my mind ever since. You know what the difference is between us and our families? She'd said, we've all had our mortality smack right in our faces. We know our time is limited and precious, but they're still operating under the illusion that there's always tomorrow. To get around to caring about what really matters, that's harsh, Susan had protested. It's honest, Margaret had replied. I'm not saying they don't love us. I'm saying they love us the way you love a piece of furniture you've had forever. You know it's there, you appreciate it. But you don't really see it anymore because it's always been part of the background. The metaphor had stung because it felt so accurate. I'd become part of the furniture in my children's lives. Reliable, functional, taken for granted. At 7:15, Brendan knocked on my back door, carrying a bag from the local bakery and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. I brought sustenance, she announced, pulling out coffee cake and fresh muffins. And I may have mentioned to a few people that you were going to be on television this morning. What few people? Oh, you know, Margaret from the library, Dorothy, Mrs. Henderson, the woman who runs the community garden ... double quotes, she trailed off under my stare. Fine, I may have called half the town. But they all adore you, Tina, they want to support you. Support me or watch me make a fool of myself. Both. Probably, but mostly support. We settled in my living room with coffee and pastries. The television tuned to Channel 12. The morning show was following its usual format: local news, weather, traffic, then human interest segments. I found myself analysing the production values with new eyes, noticing things Brenda had taught me about lighting and camera angles during our drive home from the studio yesterday. There, Brenda said suddenly, pointing at the screen. That's your lead-in. Janet Ortiz was sitting at the morning show desk, looking directly into the camera with the warm, serious expression she used for more substantial segments. Coming up after the break, she said, we're going to meet Tina Weisfeld, a retired librarian from Millbrook who's learning some difficult truths about family, support, and self-advocacy while facing a cancer diagnosis. It's a conversation I think many of our viewers will recognize in their own lives. Stay with us. The screen cut to commercial, and I felt my stomach drop somewhere near my shoes. Breathe, Brenda said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. You're about to help a lot of people feel less alone. When the show returned, the camera focused on Janet sitting in the interview area I remembered from yesterday. The lighting was soft to hear, the chairs positioned to encourage intimate conversation rather than formal presentation. I'm here with Tina Weisfeld, Janet said, a 69-year-old retired librarian who recently received a cancer diagnosis. But Tina's story isn't really about cancer. It's about discovering that the people we expect to support us don't always show up the way we hope they will, and learning to advocate for ourselves even when it feels uncomfortable. Tina, thank you for being here. There I was on screen, looking more composed than I'd felt, and sounding more articulate than I'd expected. The conversation unfolded just as I remembered it, but watching it felt like observing someone else's life. The woman on television seemed confident, thoughtful, willing to examine difficult truths about family dynamics and social expectations. I think I taught them that I was the solution to problems, not someone who could have problems of her own. Television, Tina was saying. I was so good at being the person they could count on that they never learned to see me as someone who might need counting on. Sitting in my living room, watching myself articulate insights I was still processing, I felt a strange sense of pride. This woman on screen, me, was saying things that needed saying, giving voice to experiences that were probably familiar to many viewers. My phone started buzzing during the commercial break that followed my segment. Text messages began arriving faster than I could read them. The first was from a number I didn't recognize. Just watched your interview on Channel 12. Thank you for saying what so many of us feel but can't express. You're braver than you know. Then, another, Tina, this is Barbara from the grocery store. Saw you on TV this morning, so proud of you for speaking your truth. And another, you don't know me, but I'm a friend of Brenda's. Your story brought me to tears. My husband can't understand why his family didn't show up during his cancer treatment either. You're not alone. The messages kept coming, people from my church, neighbours I'd exchanged pleasantries with for years, former library patrons, complete strangers who'd gotten my number from friends. The common thread in all of them was recognition, people seeing their own experiences reflected. In my story, holy shit, Brenda said, scrolling through her own phone. The Channel 12 Facebook page is exploding. Your interview already has 200 comments, and it's been up for 20 minutes. What kind of comments? Here, listen to this one. This woman just described my entire relationship with my adult children. I thought I was the only one dealing with this. She kept reading. Thank you for being honest about family dynamics that we're not supposed to talk about. My mother could have said every word of this interview. Finally, someone willing to discuss the emotional labor women carry their whole lives. Are there negative ones? A few. Some people saying you're being unfair to your children, that family should be private. But they're being shouted down by people sharing their own similar experiences. My phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. Hello, Mrs. Wasteford. This is Corinne Mitchell from the Millbrook Gazette. I watched your interview this morning and wondered if you'd be interested in doing a follow-up piece for our community section. We've been getting calls from readers who want to know more about your story. After I hung up from that call, the phone rang again. This time, it was a woman from a different support group in a neighbouring town, asking if I'd be willing to speak to their members about family dynamics during illness. Then another call from someone who ran a podcast about women's issues over 50. Then a woman who organised speaking events for senior centres. In the space of 2 hours, I went from someone whose own children couldn't find time to call to someone whose story was resonating with hundreds of strangers. The irony wasn't lost on me. This is insane, I said to Brenda after declining my 5th interview request of the morning. I'm not a public speaker. I'm not an expert on anything. I just told the truth about my experience. Sometimes that's exactly what people need to hear, Brenda said. The truth, from someone who's living it rather than studying it or selling solutions for it. My phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from Mira. Mom, several people have texted me about seeing you on TV this morning. What's going on? Please call me. I stared at the message for a long moment. 3 weeks since my diagnosis, and this was the first time one of my children had asked me to call them rather than waiting for me to reach out. Are you going to call her back? Brenda asked, reading over my shoulder. Eventually, but not right now. Why not? Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm not rushing to manage someone else's emotional reaction to my choices. If Mira wants to understand why I shared my story publicly, she can start by understanding why I felt I had to. The phone rang again, another local number, Mrs. Wasteford. This is Dr. Patricia Williams. I run a women's health initiative at the medical centre. I wondered if you might be interested in speaking at our next symposium about the importance of self-advocacy during medical crises. After I hung up, I looked at Brenda, who was grinning like she'd won the lottery. What? I asked, do you realise what's happening here? You've accidentally become a voice for something people desperately needed to hear. You're not just telling your story anymore. You're giving other people permission to tell theirs. I thought about the messages flooding my phone, about the comments Brenda had read from the television station's social media, about the interview requests that kept coming. Yesterday, I'd been invisible. Today, I was being seen by more people than I'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow, I had surgery. But today, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I mattered not because of what I could do for someone else, but because of who I actually was. The makeup mirror in the television studio had shown me a woman with something to say. Now I was beginning to understand that maybe people needed to hear it. The screenshot from Brenda's phone showed 847 shares, 1,203 comments, and 15,000 views on the Channel 12 Facebook post of my interview. The numbers felt abstract, impossible to connect to the quiet woman who'd sat in that television studio chair just 48 hours ago, but the responses were anything but abstract. I'd spent the morning reading through comments on my phone while sitting in the pre-surgery waiting area at the medical centre. Dr. Singh had wanted me to have the procedure done quickly after our last consultation, and somehow the timing felt perfect. I was going into surgery as someone who'd finally found her voice, rather than someone suffering in silence. The comments ranged from heartbreaking to inspiring. This could be my story word for word. Thank you for having the courage to speak what so many of us live. I'm sitting here crying because I thought I was the only daughter whose mother gives everything and gets nothing back. Shared this with my book club. We're having an emergency meeting to discuss how many of us recognize ourselves in this woman's experience. My father went through chemo alone because my siblings were too busy. This interview helped me understand how devastating that must have been for him. But it was the private messages that really got to me. People sharing their own stories of invisible caregiving, of family members who disappeared during crises, of learning to advocate for themselves after decades of advocating for others. Each message felt like a mirror reflecting back experiences I thought were uniquely mine, Brenda sat beside me in the waiting room, scrolling through her own phone with the focused intensity of someone managing a social media campaign. The stories been picked up by 3 regional news outlets, she reported. And someone from a national women's magazine wants to interview you next week. I'll be recovering from surgery next week, which makes for an even better story. Woman faces cancer. Surgery after going viral for speaking truth about family dysfunction. My family isn't dysfunctional. They're just ... I struggled to find the right word. Disconnected from me. Specifically, honey, at some point you're going to have to stop making excuses for them. The truth was, I'd heard from all 3 of my children since the interview aired. Their responses had been as predictable as they were disappointing. Mira had called yesterday evening, her voice tight with the kind of controlled anger she'd perfected during her corporate career. Mom, I cannot believe you went on television to discuss our private family business. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I've had 3 colleagues mention seeing the interview. I'm sorry you're embarrassed, I'd said. I'm not sorry I finally told the truth about how isolated I've felt. You made it sound like we don't care about you at all. You don't act like you care about me. There's a difference. The conversation had ended with Mira hanging up on me. Devon had sent a long text message that read like something he'd workshopped for his podcast. Mom, I understand you're processing a lot of difficult emotions right now, but broadcasting our family dynamics feels like a violation of trust. I'm wondering if you might benefit from talking to a professional about healthier ways to express your needs. I texted back, I'm talking to professionals, my oncologist, my surgeon, my support group, and apparently now the media. All of them see what you don't, that I deserve support during a health crisis. Casey had FaceTimed me from what looked like a campground in Colorado, tears streaming down her face as she launched into a dramatic monologue about how she'd never met to make me feel unsupported, and how she was processing her own trauma around medical stuff because of Dad's heart attack. So, you made my cancer diagnosis about your trauma? I'd asked, that's not fair. Mom, I'm doing the best I can. So am I now, sitting in the surgery waiting room. I felt oddly calm about their reactions. For 69 years, I'd managed their emotions, protected their comfort, absorbed their projections. Cancer had given me permission to stop, Mrs. Weisfard. A nurse in scrubs appeared with a clipboard. We're ready for you. Brenda squeezed my hand. I'll be right here when you wake up. And so will about half the town, based on the messages I'm getting. The truth was, more people had reached out to support me through this surgery than had contacted me during Harold's entire final illness. The library volunteers had organised a meal train. The cancer support group had sent flowers. Mrs. Henderson from the neighbourhood had dropped off homemade soup. Even people I barely knew had sent cards and texts offering help. Meanwhile, none of my children had asked about the surgery details, the recovery timeline, or whether I needed anything. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. In the pre-surgery room, as nurses prepared me for the procedure, I thought about the viral nature of my story. 15,000 people had watched me describe feeling invisible in my own family. Hundreds of them had shared similar experiences in the comments. The local newspaper wanted to do a follow-up piece. A women's health organisation wanted me to speak at their next event. I'd spent my entire adult life being invisible, and one 20-minute television interview had made me more seen than I'd ever been. Dr. Singh appeared at my bedside, calm and reassuring as always. How are you feeling, Tina? Ready, I said, surprising myself with how true it was. Good, we'll take excellent care of you. The procedure should take about 2 hours, and then you'll wake up in recovery. Your friend Brenda will be able to see you once you're alert. Doctor, thank you for encouraging me to not just survive, but thrive. I think I'm finally understanding what that means, he smiled. I saw your interview. Very brave of you to speak so honestly about your experience. You saw it. My wife made sure I watched it. She said you articulated something she's been trying to explain to me for years about the invisible work women do in families. Even my surgeon understood what my children couldn't grasp. The anesthesia took hold gradually, and my last conscious thought was about the messages on my phone. All those strangers who'd seen my story and felt less alone. All those people who'd found courage in my willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. I'd gone viral not for anything clever or entertaining, but for telling the truth about emotional neglect, invisible labor, and the courage required to advocate for yourself when the people who should love you most can't see your needs. When I woke up in recovery 3 hours later, Brenda was sitting beside my bed reading comments aloud from the Channel 12 Facebook page. "Here's a good one," she said when she saw my eyes open. This woman gave me the courage to have an honest conversation with my adult children about how they treat me. 50 years of being taken for granted ends today. How do I feel? I asked grudgingly. According to Dr. Singh, you did beautifully. Surgery went exactly as planned. According to the internet, you're a folk hero for middle-aged women everywhere. I don't want to be a folk hero. I just wanted my children to acknowledge that their mother was facing cancer. Well, you've got the acknowledgement of about 20,000 strangers so far. Sometimes the family you choose responds better than the family you're born with. She handed me my phone, which was full of notifications, messages, comments, friend requests, interview offers. The screenshot of the viral post now showed 32,000 views and climbing. "This is overwhelming," I said. "This is what happens when you stop hiding your truth. People recognize it, they connect with it, they share it." Among all the messages from strangers was one from a number I recognized. "My neighbor Mrs. Henderson, Tina, I watched your interview and wanted you to know that my daughter drove up from Philadelphia today just to check on me. She said seeing you speak about invisible care giving made her realize she's been taking me for granted. Thank you for starting a conversation that needed to happen." I showed the message to Brenda, who grinned triumphantly. "You see, you didn't just tell your story. You gave other people permission to examine their own relationships, their own patterns of giving and receiving." Over the next hour, as the anesthesia wore off and my head cleared, I read through more of the responses too. My interview, the common themes were striking: recognition, gratitude, and resolve. People saying they felt seen, understood, less alone. People saying my story had prompted difficult, but necessary conversations with their own family members. A woman named Sarah had written, "My mother sacrificed everything for our family and never asked for anything in return. After watching your interview, I called her and asked what she needed from me," she cried. I realized she'd been waiting 40 years for someone to ask that question. Another comment from someone named David, "I'm one of those children who takes my mother for granted. Your interview was a wake-up call. I'm driving to see her this weekend." And from Maria, "I've been the invisible caregiver in my family for 20 years. Your courage in speaking up has inspired me to start setting boundaries." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Wasteford, this is Janet Ortiz from Channel 12. The response to your interview has been extraordinary. When you're feeling up to it, I'd love to discuss a follow-up segment about the reaction your story has generated." "I think I accidentally started something," I told Brenda. "You didn't start it. This pattern of invisible emotional labor has been going on forever. You just finally gave it a voice." That evening, from my hospital bed, I watched the local news coverage of my viral interview. The story had grown beyond just my experience to become a broader discussion about family dynamics, caregiving responsibilities, and the courage required to speak uncomfortable truths. I'd gone into surgery as a woman facing cancer alone. I was waking up as someone whose story had touched thousands of people and sparked conversations about relationship patterns that many had never examined before. My children still hadn't called to ask about the surgery outcome. But for the first time in my adult life, that felt like their loss rather than my failure. The business cards arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after my surgery and 2 days before I was scheduled to start chemotherapy. Tina Wasteford, motivational speaker, was printed in elegant script beneath my phone number and email address. The woman who'd ordered these cards bore little resemblance to the one who'd sat in Dr. Singh's office 3 months ago, folding a cancer diagnosis letter with trembling hands. I was examining the cards at my kitchen table when Brenda knocked on my back door, carrying coffee and wearing the expression she'd adopted whenever she had news about my situation. A mixture of pride and barely contained excitement that made her look like she was holding back a secret. Those look official, she said, settling into the chair across from me and eyeing the business cards. How does it feel to have a title that's about you instead of what you do for other people? Terrifying, I admitted, but also. Right, somehow, the 6 weeks since my television interview had been a whirlwind I couldn't have imagined. The story had continued to spread, shared on social media platforms, discussed in online forums, picked up by women's magazines and health-focused websites. I'd given 3 more interviews, one for a regional newspaper, one for a podcast about women's advocacy, and one for a national magazine piece about family dynamics during health crises. Each interview had generated more responses, more people sharing their own experiences with invisible caregiving and family neglect during difficult times. I'd received over 400 messages from people who said my story had prompted them to examine their own relationships, set new boundaries, or of difficult conversations they'd been avoiding for years. The most surprising development had been the speaking requests. What started with one invitation to address a cancer support group had grown into requests from women's organizations, senior centers, healthcare conferences, and corporate wellness programs. People wanted to hear about advocacy, about recognizing your own worth, about the courage required to speak up when you've spent a lifetime staying quiet. How's the family situation? Brenda asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Complicated, I said. Which is probably the most honest thing I can say about it. The aftermath of my television interview had played out exactly as I might have predicted, if I'd been brave enough to predict it. My children's initial anger had given way to defensive justifications, then to elaborate explanations of why they couldn't provide the support I'd publicly indicated I needed. Mira had sent a long email detailing her work responsibilities and explaining that she'd already planned to be more present, but that my public criticism had made her feel manipulated and defensive. She was hurt that I'd aired our private business, but showed no curiosity about why I'd felt compelled to do so. Devon had called to inform me that he'd discussed my interview with his therapist, who'd apparently suggested that I was using my illness to guilt-trip the family. He offered to send me information about boundary-setting workshops, seemingly oblivious to the irony of lecturing someone about boundaries while refusing to acknowledge their stated needs. Casey had driven her van back to New Jersey for exactly 36 hours, during which she'd taken photos of herself, helping me organize my medication schedule and posted them on Instagram with captions about being there for family. She'd left the morning of my first chemotherapy appointment, explaining that she'd already done so much and needed to get back to her content creation schedule. Their responses had been disappointing, but not surprising. What had surprised me was how little their disappointment affected me anymore. I think, I told Brenda, that I've finally stopped waiting for them to become the people I need them to be. How does that feel? Sad, but also freeing. The truth was, my support system had reorganized itself completely in the months since my diagnosis. The cancer support group had become my Tuesday evening family. Margaret, Robert, Susan, and the others understood the realities of treatment in ways my children never could. They knew about the fatigue that went beyond tiredness, the anxiety that crept in during quiet moments, the strange grief that accompanied losing parts of your body to surgery. More importantly, they understood the complex emotions around family relationships during illness. 3 other group members had similar stories of family members who disappeared or minimized their experiences. 2 had adult children who'd been supportive initially, but gradually returned to treating the illness as an inconvenience. It's not that they don't love us, Margaret had said during a recent meeting. It's that they love the version of us that doesn't need anything from them. When we become people with real, messy, ongoing needs, they don't know how to reconcile that with their image of who we are. The library volunteers had stepped up in ways that put my own family to shame. They'd organized rides to medical appointments, brought meals during my recovery, and covered all my volunteer responsibilities without being asked. Dorothy had learned to give injections so she could help with my post-surgery medications. Margaret had researched chemotherapy side effects and arrived at my first treatment with ginger tea and anti-nausea crackers. Even more surprising had been the support from people I barely knew. Mrs. Henderson had become a daily check-in caller. The mailman asked about my treatment progress. The pharmacist had memorized my medication schedule and always inquired about side effects. My experience had become a strange inversion of everything I'd expected about illness and family. The people I'd counted on had vanished. The people I'd never thought to count on had appeared. "Tell me about the speaking engagement on Thursday," Brenda said, pulling me back to the present. Thursday's event was my biggest speaking opportunity yet, a healthcare conference with over 300 attendees, including doctors, nurses, social workers, and patient advocates. The organizer had asked me to speak about the hidden challenges of family dynamics during illness as part of a panel on patient-centered care. "I'm nervous," I admitted. "These are healthcare professionals. What if they think I'm just complaining about my family? What if they recognize that you're identifying a systemic problem they see in their practice every day?" She had a point. Dr. Singh had mentioned during one of my follow-up appointments that he'd recommended my interview to several colleagues because it articulated something he witnessed regularly. Patients whose family support looked good on paper but failed to materialize during actual treatment. "The healthcare system assumes family support," he'd said. "We discharge patients to family care without really assessing whether that care is available or adequate." Your story highlights the gap between assumption and reality. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Over the past few weeks, I'd received dozens of these. People who'd gotten my contact information through various networks and wanted to share their own stories or ask for advice. This message read, "Mrs. Weisfard, my name is Linda and I'm a social worker at Memorial Hospital. I watched your interview and have been sharing it with colleagues because it explains something we see constantly but never knew how to address. Would you ever consider speaking to our staff about recognizing patients who may lack genuine family support despite appearances?" I showed the message to Brenda, who nodded approvingly. "See, you're not complaining about your family. You're educating people about a pattern they encounter professionally but didn't have language for. When did I become someone who educates people?" The moment you decided to tell the truth instead of protecting everyone else's comfort. That afternoon, I had my third chemotherapy session. The process had become routine. Arrive at the cancer center, get weighed and of blood drawn, settle into one of the reclining chairs in the treatment room, and spend for hours with an IV drip while reading or chatting with other patients and their caregivers. The treatment room was always full of family members, spouses reading magazines, adult children scrolling through phones, occasionally someone bringing children to visit a grandparent receiving treatment. The first few sessions, I'd felt conspicuous being there alone. Now I felt oddly proud of my independence. "You're the lady from TV," said the woman in the chair next to mine. She was probably in her 50s, with a colourful scarf covering her head and laugh lines that suggested she smiled, often despite current circumstances. "That's me," I said. "I hope it was helpful." "Honey, it saved my sanity. I thought I was losing my mind thinking my family should be more supportive during my treatment. Turns out I wasn't crazy. I was just finally seeing clearly. What changed for you?" I stopped pretending their minimal effort was enough. My sister used to call once a week and ask how I was feeling, then change the subject when I actually told her. After your interview, I started being honest about what I needed instead of grateful for whatever crumbs I got. How did she respond? She got mad and accused me of being demanding. But then she started actually showing up instead of just checking a box. Sometimes people need their inadequacy pointed out before they'll address it. During the 4-hour treatment, 3 different people recognized me from the interview and shared similar stories. A man whose adult children had initially brushed off his prostate cancer diagnosis until he'd shown them my interview. A woman whose husband had been treating her breast cancer like an inconvenience until she'd used language from my television appearance to explain what she needed from him. "You gave us vocabulary," one woman said. "Before your interview, I knew something was wrong with how my family was responding, but I couldn't articulate what. You put words to feelings I didn't know how to express." Driving home from chemotherapy, I thought about the business cards in my purse and the speaking engagement on Thursday and the strange path that had led from cancer diagnosis to public advocacy. I'd started this journey trying to get my children's Attention, I'd ended up finding my voice in ways I'd never imagined. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. The caller ID showed Mira's name. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, slipping back into the maternal tone I'd used with her for 45 years. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation after your interview, and I want you to know that I've been trying to understand your perspective." "Okay, I talked to my therapist about it, and she helped me see that maybe I've been defensive instead of really listening to what you were saying." I waited, curious about where this was heading. "I know I haven't been as present as I should. But during your treatment, I guess I didn't realize how much you needed me to step up. What made you realize it now?" There was a pause, honestly. "One of my colleagues saw your interview and asked me how I was supporting you through treatment. When I tried to answer, I realized I didn't have a good answer, so it had taken a colleague's question to make my daughter examine her behavior toward her mother's cancer treatment, not her own conscience, not my explicit request for support, but social pressure from someone whose opinion mattered to her professionally. I want to do better. Mom, can you tell me what you need from me?" 6 months ago, I would have been grateful for this opening, ready to minimize my needs to make her more comfortable. Today, I felt tired and sad that it had taken public embarrassment to generate this conversation. "I need you to stop treating my cancer like a scheduling inconvenience," I said. "I need you to ask about my treatment without waiting for me to bring it up. I need you to understand that support isn't just calling to check boxes. It's actually showing up when things are difficult. I can do that. I want to do that. Good, because I'm not going to keep accepting minimal effort and calling it love." After we hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, processing the conversation. Maybe Mira would follow through, maybe she wouldn't. But either way, I'd stopped making her comfort my priority. The business cards in my purse felt like evidence of who I was becoming. Someone who spoke up, someone whose experience mattered, someone who'd learned to advocate for herself after a lifetime of advocating for others. Thursday's speaking engagement was just the beginning. I had 3 more events scheduled for the following month, a magazine interview next week, and a growing list of organizations interested in my perspective on invisible caregiving and family dynamics during illness. I'd become visible not despite my children's neglect, but because of my willingness to name it honestly. And in becoming visible, I'd helped other people see patterns in their own lives that they'd been accepting as normal. The woman who'd folded that diagnosis letter with trembling hands 3 months ago had been invisible, taken for granted, afraid to ask for what she needed. The woman sitting in this driveway with business cards that bore her name and new title had learned that her story mattered, her needs were valid, and her voice could help others find their own. It wasn't the journey I'd planned, but it was the one I needed. Tomorrow I had another chemotherapy session. Thursday I had a speaking engagement. Next week I had 2 more interviews and a support group meeting where I'd continue learning from other people facing similar challenges. My children might never become the people I'd hoped they would be during this crisis, but I'd become someone I was proud to be. Someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to matter and started insisting on it instead. The business cards were proof that sometimes the family you build around your authentic self responds better than the family that knew you when you were willing to stay invisible. I was done being invisible. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.